So I'm wondering if you all have someone or someones in plural, people in your life who see the world in radically different ways from the ways you see the world. Like when you look at them, they are on completely different journeys than the journey you're on. And for some of you, this is close friends or family, and they just see it differently, and you can't figure this out. You are racking your brain trying to figure it out because you say, look, we've had similar experiences. We grew up in the same neighborhoods. We went to the same schools. And you came out here, and I came out here. And in fact, the very things that inspire you and give you life are the things that they are actively opposed to. And relationships start to get dicey, don't they? If you've been on social media during the last few weeks, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You've probably seen some really good and healthy conversations, and you've seen some ugly, unhealthy conversations. And I say this because I think we can do better than this. And so in some sense, I'm revisiting our Fearless Conversation series from a few weeks back. I think we can do better. And so I want to reflect with you on two things this morning. First, the importance of remembering our stories. And then second, what it looks like for us to actually become the storyteller. And here's what I mean by that. If I were to ask you if you see the world the same exact way you saw the world 10 years ago, if you see God and philosophy, theology, religion, politics, economy, relationships, if you see the world the same way you did 10 years ago, many of you in this room would say, well, of course not. I've had new experiences, and these experiences have led me to different places to see things in new ways. I've grown. We could even go on to ask, do you see the world the same way you did 5 years ago? Some of you would say, well, no, I've had these new experiences and I see the world differently. I've grown. Some of you are in the midst of such tremendous growth in your life right now. If I were to ask you, do you see the world the same way you did at this time last year? Or do you see the world the same way you did 6 months ago? You would say, no, I'm growing. So, tell that story. That's a compelling story. That's the story we want to hear. How did you move from point A to point B? How did you change positions from here to here? Or how did you get a new relationship from here to there? Tell us that story. That's a compelling story. And I get it. Stories can sometimes be really hard because there's a piece of us that sides with Will, the son, and Big Fish. Dad, don't give me the stories, just give me the facts. Just tell me how it is and put the events in chronological order and make it easy for me. Then I can make sense of the world. But here's the thing. Your life and my life, our lives, are made up of way more than just facts. Our lives are like little stories along the way. And see, they have to do with the things of our hearts and our souls and people and relationships, and these things can't always be put into nice, neat categories, can they? So, speaking of stories, I want to look at a story this morning. It comes from the book of Acts. This is an absolutely fascinating story. It is one of my favorite stories. In it, it's a story of transformation, Peter's transformation. And the storyteller in Acts is a genius. He tells the story in such a brilliant way. So a few points before we go into the story. Cornelius is a Roman citizen. He's also a centurion, meaning he is an officer in command of about 100 troops. Peter is a good Jew. Peter is also one of the earliest Jesus followers. First century Jews despised Romans. Here's what you also need to know. Cornelius was given this vision, and he was told that he should send men to Peter and bring Peter back to his house because he wanted to learn from Peter. And here's where the story picks up. About noon the next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up to the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. Good stories happen when people fall into trances. He saw the heaven opened and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its four corners. In it were all kinds of four-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. Then he heard a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." Now I'm going to pause there for just a moment because we have to understand something about history here. Peter is Jewish. We can track the Jewish people back several generations. Remember when the Hebrew people were in Egypt in slavery, and God sends Moses to bring them out of slavery, and then they were wandering around in the wilderness. As the Hebrew people are wandering around in the wilderness, their God starts teaching them a new way to be in the world. And so their primary question, the primary dialogue between the Hebrew people and God was, how do we become a distinct tribe? And so keep in mind, when you're reading Leviticus and all these weird, odd laws, and then you get to the 10 Commandments, and you're wondering, what do these have to do with anything? These are always laws that would make them a distinct people. There was lots of laws. You might remember reading through a lot of weird food laws. Food laws, dietary laws, were at the heart of distinction. Remember, you could eat certain animals, but other animals, the unclean animals, you could not eat. This was a daily reminder for them that they depended on something other than themselves. It was at the heart of their own distinction. Now, so fast forward several generations now to Peter's day, the first century. The religious authorities of the day started adding on law after law, regulation after regulation. And they started saying things like, hey, look, not only are certain animals clean and unclean, but if a clean animal comes into contact with an unclean animal, then the clean also becomes unclean, and you can't eat that either. Peter is a very, very good Jew. So how does Peter respond when God says, get up, kill, and eat? And think about it. The sheet coming down from heaven with all different kinds of animals in it, four-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. If we were to lower a sheet from the heavens, holding it by its four corners, then all the animals in the sheet would be touching each other, right? Meaning all the animals would at that point become unclean. So how does Peter respond? The voice says, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean." The voice said to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." This happened 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up to heaven. Now, while Peter was greatly puzzled about what to make of the vision that he had seen, suddenly the men sent by Cornelius appeared. They were asking for Simon's house and were standing by the gate. They called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was staying there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Look, 3 men are searching for you. Now get up, go down, and go with them without hesitation, for I have sent them." So Peter went down to the men and said, "I'm the one you are looking for. What is the reason for your coming?" They answered, "Cornelius, a centurion, an upright and God-fearing man who is well spoken of by the whole Jewish nation, was directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and to hear what you have to say." So Peter invited them in and gave them lodging. Now I'm going to pause for one more moment. Peter, remember, was a good Jew. Jews did not associate with Romans, with Gentiles. Why? Because the religious authorities of Peter's day started taking the dietary laws and bleeding them over to people. So not only were certain animals unclean, but they start saying, look, he or she or they are unclean. And if you, as the clean and pure, come in contact with the impure and the unclean, then you too will be made unclean. A Jew would never go into the house of a Gentile, and a Gentile would never be able to come into the house of a Jew. But not so for Peter, because Peter has a vision. Peter is in a trance. Here's how the story ends. The next day he got up and went with them, and some of the believers from Joppa accompanied him. The following day they came to Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. On Peter's arrival, Cornelius met him, and falling at his feet, worshipped him. But Peter made him get up, saying, "Stand up, I am only a mortal." And as he talked with him, he went in and found that many had assembled, and he said to them, "You yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or to visit a Gentile. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection." So, a couple of reflection points on this story. First, the nature of change. Like Peter, many of us here, if you were at all raised in the church or raised in a religious tradition, many of us were given really good and helpful ideas and traditions and practices. They were handed down to us. Practices and traditions that made us better and that made the community and the world better. And if we're honest, many of us were also given really unhelpful and destructive practices and traditions and ideas that were handed down to us. Practices and traditions that actually pushed you away from God rather than bringing you closer to God. And so upon reading this story, we could ask a really simple question. Does your religion or does your religious upbringing keep you from seeing and being a part of the new thing that God is doing? A friend of mine tells me the story of him leaving a mission organization. He has been involved in mission work his entire life, since he was a kid. And he said for a long time, things with this organization just didn't feel right, but he couldn't really pinpoint it. He couldn't identify it. Until one week they're in this third world country and they're passing through a village. And they get out and they start talking to the people. And my friend was talking to some of the kids and they were hungry. They had not eaten that day. Now my friend knew that in their vans they had extra food. But the leader of the group said, "We can't give them that food. We're here for spiritual matters." And to my friend, this simply didn't make sense. For my friend, when he saw hungry kids and he had extra food, it was all of a sudden a spiritual matter. He said it was his last trip with this organization. He left it and he started a new thing. And by the way, if you've ever left your tribe, you know the pain and the grief that's involved with this. But why did he leave? Because his religion, the practices and traditions that were handed down to him, were keeping him from being a part of the new thing that God was calling him to. Change is hard. Transformation and struggle often go hand in hand. It's hard to imagine transformation without struggle. A few days after my 18th birthday, I went down to Springfield, Missouri, where my sister was in college. It was an hour-and-a-half drive. I went down to Springfield to to together get our first tattoos. I got a big Jesus fish on my back. I would show you, but it would be a little awkward to take my shirt off in church. So we're in Springfield. My sister and I, we get tattoos together. I stay at her house that night, and the next morning I go back home. When I got home, my mom was there. Now, I thought she would be proud of her boy for getting a big Jesus fish tattoo on his back with John 16:33 below it. You can look that up later. And so, being really proud, I took my shirt off and I did the whole flexing thing, and I said, "Ma, what do you think of this?" She started to cry. I was really naive. I said, "Ma, are those tears of joy?" They were not tears of joy. They were tears of pain and sadness and disappointment. And she says, "How could you do this? Why wouldn't you tell me?" And so I started to explain. Well, Sis and I, we were in Springfield, and she stops me. "Wait a minute. Your sister has one?" "How could you do this? I thought our relationship was better than this. Why couldn't you tell me before you did this?" Now, fast forward in time, 10 years. Can I see the picture? Guess who has a tattoo? That's my mom. She got this on what would have been my brother's 30th birthday. We called him Big B. She used to always read us the book, "I'll Love You Forever, I'll Like You for Always." She calls me on the way to the tattoo parlor. She says, "Oh, man, I got this great idea, and here's what I want to get." And it's Brandon's 30th birthday, and she's all excited about this, like she's been there all along, you know what I mean? And so I said, "Ma, that's really cool, but do you remember what you said to me when I got my first tattoo?" And get this, I'm not kidding. She says, "Oh, yeah, but, people change." Oh, I get it. People change. You see, we do better. We tend to be more loving, more gracious when we remember the struggle in our own stories, and our own stories of change and transformation, especially when it has to do with people who aren't on the same journey that we're on, who see the world differently, who see things differently. And some of you might recall the stories I shared with you a few weeks ago, the stories of my own transformation, of how there was a point in my life where I used to stand adamantly opposed to, where I used to hate the LGBT community, and how different things happened along the way. Stories happened. And then how it brought me to a place now to where I feel that God had called me to actually stand in solidarity with them and to love them and to refer to them as my brothers and sisters. And if I'm honest with you, on my worst days, if I'm talking to someone who doesn't hold that position or is on a different journey from my own, I can say things like, "Well, yeah, of course you don't see it the way I see it. You're just not as smart as me. Or you're just not as open as me, or you're behind the times." And the truth is, when I can then go back and reflect on those conversations, every single time, hindsight's always 20/20, isn't it? Every single time, I can see that that wasn't helpful, it wasn't effective, it wasn't Christian, it wasn't humble, it was ego-driven. And on my best days, I can simply remember my story of transformation. And I can tell the story of the struggle, the story of losing sleep over this issue, the story of losing friends over this issue. And I can simply tell the story of where I believed God was calling me to go, the places God was calling me to go, the things God was calling me to do. You see, the temptation might be to look at the Scriptures as this ancient and outdated document. Seriously? Sheets coming down from the heavens, filled with different animals of all kinds. What does this have to do with us in the 21st century? But what if we started looking at the Bible as a library of books filled with stories about what it was like for people when they began waking up? When they started to see the new things that God was doing all around them. When they started to come alive. So we could ask each other the question, have you seen the sheets being dropped down from the heavens by the four corners? Because if you haven't seen that, you are missing out on the height of the human experience, on the height of the Christian experience. People change, and change often comes with struggle. We kick and scream along the way. Do you remember the story of your own transformation? Can you tell that story? Will, in the film, the son in Big Fish, was so resistant to the stories of his father. Dad, just give me the facts. But in the moment when things mattered most, Will becomes the storyteller. He becomes a brilliant storyteller. In this final scene of the film, his dad is on his deathbed, literally taking his last breaths. And he says to his son, "Tell me how it happens." Take a look.